The B-17 bombers were widely produced and used in World War II, with over 12,000 built from 1938 to 1945. And as you might guess, so many were produced because many of them didn't make it back home after each mission. Being one of the 10 crew members of these monsters of the air was one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire conflict. But without a doubt, there were roles and jobs that were more dangerous than others inside this aircraft. Ever wondered which part of the plane was most likely to be fatal in action? You probably think the ball turret or tail gunner was the most dangerous position. But actually, these were some of the safest places inside the bomber, strange as it may seem. Well, in this video, we'll go over the safest and most dangerous positions to be in inside these aircraft during the conflict. Comment right now, what role would you take if you were a B-17 crew member? That way, we would know exactly if you would survive this conflict or not. Make yourself comfortable and welcome to Guns Club. During the conflict, concrete statistics tracked the number of bombers shot down, but detailed studies of the casualties within each of these are usually scarce. However, one of the most revealing studies on this was conducted between June and August of 1944, in which both the causes and the number of casualties among bomber crews were studied in depth. 3 months may seem brief, but during this time there were 1,117 crew casualties. Documented by this study, 40 bomber groups that participated in missions throughout Europe were studied. So this data is very reliable and we will use it for this video. The 10 crew members of each bomber were distributed as follows. We will go over each one, ordered from the safest position to the most dangerous. So let's get started right away. The co-pilot's seat is, unsurprisingly, the safest spot on the plane. The co-pilot sat beside the pilot and acted as second in command. Normally, the pilot and the co-pilot could take turns flying if needed. The co-pilot acted as a communicator between the crew members and could sometimes repair malfunctions if necessary. Co-pilots made up 5.5% of the casualties and 6.8% of the wounded, being the safest role on the entire aircraft. The second safest job on the entire aircraft, and I'm sure many will be surprised. It was the ball gunner, better known as the belly gunner or belly gunner, which is probably the most famous gunner role in the entire bomber. We've talked a lot about them in other videos, and in one we even talked about how they would drop the turret to the ground in emergencies to save weight. During the conflict, the ball gunner was thought to have the worst place to be inside the bomber. It was dangerous, uncomfortable, and unsettling. Only short-statured gunners could get in and out of this ball. Emergencies hit them hardest because they had to follow a strict protocol. The ball turret was the plane's busiest part. Side and bottom attacks were really very common, and since they were so common too, the turret used to take a lot of fire, but statistically it was the best place to be inside the bomber. As a gunner, from a risk point of view, of course. Ball turret gunners made up 6.4% of the casualties and 5.9% of those wounded in combat. The pilot had the next most dangerous job. His job was not only to fly the plane, as is commonly believed, but he also had other roles. The pilot served as the captain of the bomber, and his main role was to ensure the success of the mission. That meant he made the important decisions to attack or retreat, to abandon the plane or crash with it. The pilot always had the final say. Because of the German tactics of frontal attack, the pilots were also at risk along with the co-pilots, but it was somewhat less common. Pilots accounted for 7.3% of the fallen and 7.4% of the wounded. In the order of risk, the pilot was followed by the job of radio operator, who had a very simple task, handling the bomber's communications. Usually, bombers worked in formation, and communication was extremely important in these groups. The radio operator could also communicate with command centers to obtain important information during flight, and had access to a camera, which could be used for intelligence purposes. The radio operator was in the center of the bomber, perhaps the safest point in it, and much of He was seated at a desk. With his large radio transmitter, he could also defend the bomber with an upper machine gun that only had a view toward the rear of the bomber. These made up 7.3% of those killed and 8.6% of those wounded in the air. In order of risk, the radio operator was followed by the flight engineer's job. The flight engineer was responsible for repairing malfunctions and assisting with engine controls. He was right behind the pilot and co-pilot, and he was also in charge of the top turret. That turret was important because it had a 360-degree view and was mainly responsible for stopping attacks from above. It was seen as less demanding since it lacked views of the lower and middle areas. I work inside the bomber. They made up 9.1% of the dead and 8.3% of the wounded. Their casualties are high for a crew member who was once near the center of the plane. Next on the list of lethality is the tail gunner. The tail gunner was in charge of the machine guns that were right at the end of the plane. This job was often viewed as very dangerous, but statistically it was not. They had at their disposal two .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns with magnified sights, and they also had ballistic projections. The tail was the point where most attacks were received. That's why this turret was vital for the crew. His work area was comfortable with plenty of space and a comfortable chair, and they didn't have to stand bumping shoulders with another gunner or be locked inside a big sphere. Because of their protection, more were wounded than killed. 7.3% of tail gunners were killed in action, while 13.5% of the wounded were tail gunners. This shows that their cabin was perhaps the safest. Now we move on to the most dangerous jobs on the bomber. If you had one of these roles, every time you left the base, it was like flipping a coin to see if you'd come back or not. Next on the list of deadliest roles was the Navigator. The Navigator was a crew member who has been quite underappreciated by history. You likely didn't realize this B-17 crew role existed. The Navigator sat at the cockpit's front. His job was to plot a safe route through the fierce German air defenses. Once the bombs had been dropped, the anti-aircraft defenses could be moved and appear out of nowhere. It was a tough job that needed accurate current information. They could also work in the defense of the bomber with two side machine guns that were on each side. These were called cheek machine guns. Due to their forward position, they were usually wounded more often than the pilots. They made up 11.8% of the fallen and 12.2% of those wounded in combat others. The second most lethal job on the bomber was precisely that of the bombardier. This crew member sat even farther forward than the Navigator and the pilot. His job, as his title suggests, was to drop the bombs when they reached the target. It was the calmest job on the bomber, maybe if we're talking about workload. However, in later versions of the B-17, they had a double machine gun at their disposal, which was commonly called chin turrets. That meant they were also responsible for defending the bomber with .50 caliber machine guns and a wide range of action. The bombers caused 16.3% of casualties and 17.7% of wounded. That meant bombers were nearly 3 times more likely to die than the co-pilot, pilot, and ball turret gunner. The reason was probably that they were in the very front part of the plane, where they usually took more shrapnel hits and also fighter attacks. By far, the most dangerous job on the bomber was that of the waist gunner. They were the men who fell the most in combat on these planes. They were 2 men who operated the machine guns at the beginning of the tail, which gave a view to the sides of the bomber. They had a very wide range of action, and interestingly, their positions often caused them to bump into and get in each other's way. It was a narrow part of the bomber. They also reported wing damage, and the pilot knew exactly what issues these people had. These gunners suffered many more casualties because of their position. The deflection of bullets fired from the fighters and the attempts to avoid the tail turret made that part of the bomber much more likely to be attacked. In fact, many times B-17 bombers, because of the heavy damage they took in that area, could completely lose the tail of the plane. Therefore, these gunners made up 19% of the casualties and 21.1% of the wounded. Other statistics, like this one from the 95 The Bomb Group, which covers a longer period of time, confirm this information so you can understand just how horrifying this statistic is. In World War II, approximately 10.5 million infantry soldiers fought, not counting the wounded. Only 400,000 soldiers died in this conflict. Among all the branches of the armed forces, the casualty rate for infantry soldiers was close to 37%. That meant a waist gunner was almost 6 times more likely to die in combat than a regular infantry soldier. All the crew members did extremely risky jobs, and it's admirable how they were more than willing to risk their lives that way for their nation. In this video you see on screen, we're talking about the story, particularly about a waist gunner, who even had a capture reward issued by the German government. I highly recommend that video. Thanks for watching this one, and goodbye. Subscribe to the channel.